Thanks. We're going to go ahead and get started just because we've got a lot to cover in 1 hour, and I would like to leave plenty of time, hopefully, for questions and discussion. Let me just get my Zoom screen situated here. So Hannah, please keep an eye on the chat. I'm going to minimize that on my end.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us to discuss PANGEA, which is an effort to scope a NASA terrestrial ecology field campaign in the tropics. I'm Elsa Ordway. I'm an assistant professor at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I'll introduce the rest of our leadership team in just a minute. We're very excited that you're here at our very first event to engage you all in this process to scope a NASA campaign in the tropics, which we believe has the potential to address some of Earth's most pressing challenges, including climate change, land use change, food security, and biodiversity conservation. So for those who are just joining, we are recording this meeting and we'll make it available online on our website. We'll send an email out to all attendees and folks on our mailing list as well once that's posted. We're also going to do our best to make sure the transcript is available online as well in multiple languages. So today we're going to cover what a NASA Tropical Ecology Field campaign is and how we scope it. We'll talk about past NASA campaigns that we can learn from. Then we'll go into an overview of specifically what we aim to address with PANGEA. And like I said previously, we're hoping to leave at least 20 to 30 minutes for discussion and questions. Some logistics and housekeeping before we dive in. Hannah Stouter, who is a PhD student here at UCLA and a member of our leadership team, will be coordinating a lot of things on the back end today. So thank you, Hannah. Hannah's going to start sharing these important links to the PANGEA website, community guidelines, which I'll go through in just a minute. There's a Google Jamboard, which I'll also talk about in just a minute, and our Get Involved page, which we'll return to at the end. If you have any questions or issues, or you're running into challenges accessing these links, feel free to drop a message into the chat to Hannah, and she'll do her best to help. So before I talk about community guidelines, I just want to go to our Google Jamboard here for a second. So if you click on the link that Hannah just shared, it'll take you to this page here. And this is an opportunity for you to click on this sticky note icon on the left here. And then you can enter a comment, idea, thought at any point throughout the webinar today. Click Save, and you can move it around on this Jamboard. So this is going to be an opportunity for all of you to just share comments, ideas, thoughts in real time. And we'll save this, and the leadership team will review this afterwards to incorporate this feedback. And if you want to leave your name and contact information, you're also welcome to do so. But if you just want to leave a general comment, that's fine too. And like I said, we will make time for questions and discussion as well at the end of the webinar today. All right, let me get the slides back up here. So now I'd like to just review briefly our community guidelines. There's a lot more detail about this on our website. So actually I'll go back to our website here. If you go to the community guidelines tab at the top of our website, you can get this document and download it or open it in a browser. There's a lot of detail that I'm not going to go into today, but what I do want to emphasize is that we are really doing our best to ensure an inclusive and equitable environment for all members of this scoping process. And that's why we've established these guidelines, which we expect to be followed at all times during the tropical forest scoping effort. And that includes at workshops, during webinars like this, when using email, Slack, any other mode of communication. And these are designed to promote respect and collaboration among our community members. And we hope that by adhering to these guidelines, we can create a more welcoming space where everyone in this scoping effort can thrive. If you have any questions or do want to report anything, I encourage you to email me directly. My email information is here. And you can also, again, go to those community guidelines and get more detail on reporting. These were derived from UCLA and NASA policies and reporting requirements, and they are very much meant to be updatable. So we will continue to gather community input to update these guidelines as we grow our tropical scoping community. I also want to now acknowledge that this scoping effort is very much a team effort. So I'm PI on this scoping effort, but we have an incredible leadership team that brings a great deal of expertise from past NASA campaigns, past and present NASA campaigns. You'll hear from 4 additional team members today, but know that all of these folks are working in the background to make this scoping effort a success. I also want to acknowledge our funding support here on the left. So this is primarily funded by a terrestrial ecology scoping grant from NASA. We also have incredibly generous and valuable funding support from the U.S. Forest Service International, the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, and the Congo Basin Institute, which is really going to allow us to provide more direct support for international engagement in the scoping effort. And I also want to shout out a lot of these different institutional partners that we're already beginning to actively engage. We are very interested in making sure that this scoping effort and potential campaign in the tropics aligns with efforts, with existing activities. And so we're already starting to work with these institutions listed here, and we look forward to developing other institutional partnerships as we continue to expand this effort. So I'm now going to pass it on to Peter Griffiths, who is a scientist at NASA Goddard and the founding director of the Carbon Cycle and Ecosystems Office, and the project manager for ABOVE, which we'll hear more about, the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, as well as NASA's Carbon Monitoring System. And Peter was also the project support manager for LBA ECO, which we'll also hear more about. So Peter's going to tell us a little bit more now about what a NASA terrestrial ecology field campaign is.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. So you can read this probably faster than I can read it out loud to you. So, and I've been told to be concise, so I'm going to drill in on this slide to what is a NASA field campaign. And the thing that really makes a field campaign a NASA field campaign is spaceborne observations and hopefully airborne observations as well. There are many excellent organizations that we work with who have long-term observations on the surface, on the ground, who know their systems inside and out, and working with those kinds of partner organizations in a field campaign where NASA brings in the airborne assets, the space observations, and the large scale modeling frameworks is really what makes a NASA field campaign. Next, please. So the past NASA terrestrial ecology field campaigns started off with Fife in the 1980s, and then followed on by Boreas, which took place in the southern end of the boreal forest in Canada. We used to think that Boreas worked up north, but once we got into ABOVE, we found out that actually Boreas was working in the south. And then LBA ECO, which was part of the LBA project led by Brazil. Michael's going to go more into that. And then currently running is the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. There's those first 4 are distinct because they were all community developed, bottom up, brought to NASA, often by people who were inside NASA. But the funding was much more driven by the community. You can go back to the...
Sorry about that.
Whoops, that's all right. And ABOVE is noteworthy in that Diane Wickland found that she needed to solicit through this scoping study process what the next field campaign was going to be. I have a theory about why that happened to be, that those first 3 were a little more bottom up, and then the pump had to be primed for what became ABOVE, and now for these 2 field campaigns, but I will not go into that in the intent for being concise. So let me see, the next slide is one that, am I doing this one or are you?
I can take this over. Yeah, thanks, Peter. And
Okay,
actually, I'm
so
noticing too that your name is listed as my name, Elsa Ordway, and this may be for a few folks. So if you want to change your name, and Xiaoming, I see yours is too. So if you go to participants and go to the 3 dots next to it, and you can
I'll
click
take care of
rename.
that.
I'm not sure how that happened.
I'd noticed that a lot of people were named Elsa.
We're named Elsa today.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So what does it actually mean to scope a terrestrial ecology field campaign? We have funding for 1 year to scope this, right? And so we don't actually have a campaign funded yet. Hopefully we will be selected. But what I want to highlight is that this is, again, a 1-year effort where we really will be working to engage the research community, which is all of you and many, many more folks, to identify scientific research priorities and opportunities, to build relationships with you all and other institutional partnerships, community members, and define shared goals. We will need to determine the geographic scope of this potential campaign, and we'll need to evaluate campaign feasibility. So two different projects have been funded to scope proposals over this next year. We are one of them, and ARID is another group that's scoping a potential campaign as well. At the end of 2024, at the end of next year, we and ARID will be delivering white papers to the NASA Terrestrial Ecology Program Manager, and those will be reviewed by a panel, and decisions will be made about which campaign should be funded. For whichever campaign is funded, that will result in a 6 to 9 year campaign. So that's the next year we have ahead. And here's a timeline, and we will start to actually update the website with much more detailed information about forthcoming activities, hopefully in the next week or so. So this is our kickoff webinar today. We have an AGU town hall. We're going to actively try our best to incorporate feedback from collaborators in the tropics by physically having a regional consultation in Central Africa, in the Americas, in Asia. We'll have a community workshop that's going to be very similar to what we carry out at each of those regional consultations here in the US, in Washington, DC. We will develop working groups soon in the coming weeks to lead different efforts to investigate and research and write different components of this scoping paper. And we'll solicit quite a bit of feedback later in 2024 before we ultimately submit that white paper to NASA at the end of 2024. So I believe I'm going to hand this back over to Peter to just kind of share a little bit about how these campaigns are meant to focus the community's attention. And then Peter will go into more detail about the current NASA campaign that's actively wrapping up, the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment.
So I think I will add to the timeline that Hank Margolis, the Terrestrial Ecology Program Manager, who will be retiring at the end of December, has explicitly said that it is at the discretion of the next Terrestrial Ecology Program Manager whether any of these field campaigns will be executed. So there isn't a guarantee that the TE program will conduct a field campaign. That's something still to be determined. Hopefully one of these will be selected. I feel these field campaigns, approach these big science questions in important regions and biomes. I've mentioned LBA Eco, which was across mostly the Brazilian part of the Amazon, above in boreal forest and tundra ecosystems. They're really important for allowing a broad community to use space-based measurements on into the future. So one of the legacies of LBA Eco, one of the legacies of above, will be the satellite program of record, which the field campaign has enabled people to use NASA observations and observations from the Earth observation platforms of our partner organizations in Europe and Japan and et cetera, to continue the understanding of how Earth ecosystems are functioning and how they're changing. So once again, drilling in on that space-based observations. It's been really important with the collaborations that we've established, both across the country and internationally in these field campaigns. The training and education of the next generations of scientists is intrinsic to the whole thing. Michael, I'm sure that you shared my great pleasure in seeing that one of our LBA Eco undergrads was just awarded a MacArthur Genius award. It's like, I knew her when when she was a field technician. That's Lucy Hutura for people who don't know that. And the long legacy of data for future research. And I think you can go right into above at this point. So you see the scaling diagram off to the right. That's a view of what I was referring to about how site and site-based observations can be scaled using aircraft and satellite measurements, and then into a modeling framework. One of the things that that above has explicitly did, more so than any of the previous field campaigns, was include social systems as part of the ecosystem. And I'm glad to see that PANGEA is doing that. I think ARID is doing that as well. This vulnerability and resilience framework was introduced actually by Libby Larson during the science definition team process with above. And in that, we're looking how the causes of change are drivers to changes to ecosystems. Changes to ecosystems have impacts on ecosystem services. The changes in ecosystem services have consequences to social systems. And hopefully with NASA, we are producing actionable information, policy relevant information, so that society and decision makers can make better decisions. In above, the overarching science question is how vulnerable or resilient are ecosystems and society to environmental change in the Arctic and boreal regions of North America. And the overarching science objective is to investigate the underlying processes and their interactions that control vulnerability and resilience in these ecosystems to environmental change, and to assess how people within and beyond the region may respond to changes in these systems. You can go to the next one. We've had an extensive set of airborne, these little, I don't even know what to call that color. Rectangles are L-band SAR synthetic aperture radar, ground tracks. There are hyperspectral imaging, LIDAR, and many other instruments that have been flown across this. As you can see from these permafrost zones that they're mapped out across, we get a lot of different ecoregions within the area, and not shown on this because it would make it completely impossible to interpret, is that there are approximately 6,000 ground sites that are within the footprints of the airborne instruments that have been flown over these years. And most of those are operated by partner organizations and not funded directly by NASA. So it's been super important to have the partner organizations involved. And you'll go to the next one. Please go to the website to see the many above.nasa.gov, to see the many hundreds of publications that have been released to date. And let's go to the next one. And then the other part of the legacy is the data sets. I actually see, I just got this from the Oak Ridge DAC, it says 180 data sets. I think the actual number is 266 data sets that have been archived, and there are several hundred more that are in the pipeline that are planned. Many of these are regional products, like the two that are shown off to the right, but we also have circumpolar products that are responsive to or part of above, because even though the groundwork was not done in the Eurasian Arctic, the satellite remote sensing is quite capable of of creating global data sets or circumpolar data sets that are important for understanding these systems. And I am going to turn things over to
Michael. Great.
Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So now Michael Keller is going to be talking about LBA. Michael's a scientist at the USDA Forest Service and a distinguished visiting scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. And Michael, critically, was also a NASA project scientist for LBA ECO, which he'll be talking about.
Okay, the large-scale biosphere-atmosphere experiment in Amazonia was an experiment in social relations. It was an international program led by Brazil, and the social relations were we scientists who managed to bring it off together with our government and NGO partners and university partners. The program was initiated in 1998 in Brazil. It's still an active government program of the Brazilian Ministry of Science and Technology. It was originally intended for all of Amazonia, and we did have activities outside of Brazil, but it ended up being focused in Brazil. The NASA Terrestrial Ecology Program sponsored what Peter called LBA ECO. That was our name for our NASA contribution. There were other NASA contributions from the hydrology program and the land use and land cover change program, which was brought together with LBA ECO. And LBA to date is still the largest coordinated regional Earth system science study I think that ever took place. And we learned a great deal about, and I'd like to go to the next slide. So LBA started, this is a picture of the 1995 LBA Concise Experimental Plan. To put 1995 in perspective, folks, you couldn't do a Google search in 1995, and you stored your data on something called a floppy disk. If you don't know what a floppy disk is, you can look it up afterwards. The overarching questions of LBA were, how does Amazonia function as a regional entity? And how will changes in land use and climate affect the biological, chemical, and physical functions of Amazonia, including the sustainability of the region and influence of Amazonia on regional and global climate? These are still potent questions today. We've learned a lot toward answering them. The NASA LBA ECO contribution focused on carbon storage, nutrient dynamics, trace gas fluxes, and the prospect for sustainable land use. And you can kind of see the 1990s language in there. Next slide. And how about the 1990s diagram? This wiring diagram is just a takeoff on the old Bretherton Earth System diagram. And we, as LBA ECO, the NASA contribution, participated in some of these boxes, and the rest of LBA contributed to others and touched on all of the topics that you see listed on that slide. We tried to take what was at the time a very complete Earth system science perspective. Next slide. LBA was a smashing success in terms of capacity building. These are just a compilation of LBA ECO publications shown by percentage of authors. The red line are the student contributions to first authored papers, of which there were about 700 in LBA ECO. And the Brazilian contribution was nearly half as first authored papers. Brazilian students reached up to 30% by the time I cut off this compilation. So we did a great deal in terms of bringing up people into the program, and they're active in Brazil today as scientific leaders, as government leaders, as leaders in the NGO community, and we see their names in the press and in the literature all the time, and we're very proud of that. Next slide. So LBA has I don't think I used the word monumental, but I'll take it, a great legacy. We trained over 1,000 students, including over 500 PhD and master's students, published over 2,000 papers, involved over 2,000 scientists, and learned a great deal about the function of the Amazon ecosystem and how it relates to the Earth's system. Next slide. But LBA was not the be all and end all. We have to remember that LBA started 25 years ago. The world has changed. The climate has changed very noticeably. I was in Manaus a few weeks ago and it was 38 degrees centigrade. We don't remember that temperature during LBA for Manaus. Science and technology have advanced really significantly. I just made a few mentions about how computation has changed, but also satellite observation has changed drastically. At the beginning of LBA in 1999, NASA Terra launched. For those of you who wonder, those instruments on Terra included MODIS and Moppet, Miser, Ceres, and Aster. Those are retiring now, but we have a great deal more in space that we can learn about. Our capabilities are much greater now. And also our questions are much more pointed now, because when we started LBA, we were saying, well, what's out there and how are tropical forests changing? And now we ask really pointedly whether tropical forests will survive the changes. With this in mind, we are scoping the potential for a pan-tropical campaign that we call PANGEA. And PANGEA is not simply a continuation of LBA. It needs to be something entirely different. And it's up to you in the community to tell us what that needs to be. And thanks a lot. Thanks
Thanks, Michael. And the last thing I'll say about that pan-tropical piece, as I mentioned earlier, a big part of this year of scoping is scoping the geographic domain. There's aspects of this, particularly the satellite analyses and the modeling components that can and will be pan-tropical. But then, of course, there's going to have to be selection of kind of super sites or sites that are representative of certain dimensions of these tropical systems that will allow us to address certain questions and carry out scaling. And so we'll have to identify where those sites are for coordinated field and airborne campaigns. Okay, so now I want to really start to hone in on what PANGEA is. And by doing that, I want to first start with motivating really the importance of tropical ecosystems. So despite covering less than 10% of the ice-free land surface, tropical ecosystems maintain anywhere from 2/3 to upwards of 80% of all species on Earth. Tropical regions are also home to over 3 billion people, and they constitute major water and heat pumps, contributing to both regional and global climate systems. We know that based on our best estimates, they account for over 30% of terrestrial net primary productivity, and they store anywhere from about 25 to 40% of total terrestrial biomass, depending on how you're estimating that. Tropical forest regions, as Michael just alluded to, are also undergoing a huge amount of change at a really rapid pace. They're entering a no analog state, given how different systems are now. Temperatures are soon going to be hotter than most tropical systems have experienced during their evolutionary history. And so this is going to really demand of species in these systems, range shifts, adaptation, acclimation. These systems are also under a huge amount of pressure in the form of cropland and pasture land expansion. And that sort of land use and land cover change in the tropics is currently the single greatest driver of deforestation, causing about 80% of forest conversion globally. Tropical forest structure and function as a result of all of these changes could be seriously diminished by the end of the century, resulting in huge climate feedbacks to the rest of the Earth system. And even though we know that tropical forests have a huge impact on the entire Earth system, we still lack a huge amount of basic knowledge about them. So I now want to hand it over to Junji Liu to share information about some additional motivation for this campaign. Junji Liu is a scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at JPL, and she's also the science team lead for the Orbiting Carbon Observatory.
Thank you, Elsa. So, I mean, as Elsa mentioned, the PANGEA is really focused on the whole tropics. So each of the 3 tropical continents has its own unique climate, plant distributions, and response to climate anomalies. So in this study, we use column CO2 observation and solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence SIF observation from OCO2, and also carbon monoxide observation from MARPID satellite. We quantified the response of tropical continents to the 2015-2016 El Nino in terms of anomalies in net carbon fluxes, photosynthesis, respiration, and fire. We found that even though the net carbon flux anomaly from each tropical continent have similar magnitude as shown here, like the arrow top, like pointing to the top, the pathways that cause the net carbon flux anomaly are different. So over tropical South America was primarily driven by reduction in photosynthesis, while Africa was driven by increase in respiration, while tropical Asia was driven by increase of fire activity. So because of this really unique response of different tropical continents really tells us the importance to understand not only the process happening over tropical South America, but also over the whole tropical continents. Thank you. Now hand back to Elsa.
Thanks. So with PANGEA specifically, like LBA and above, this campaign is going to be multi-scale, incorporating field measurements and tower measurements with airborne campaigns, as well as satellite observations and modeling. As Michael mentioned before, unlike LBA, we now have a wealth of satellite assets and time series archives that were not available when LBA happened. And there's really a need to kind of better understand what that can teach us about tropical systems. How can we fill in the gaps with targeted field campaigns that allow us to better scale and provide scaling information to integrate these satellite data sets? So this is really going to be a scoping effort that's going to, in large part, identify different locations that allow us to address specific questions and processes that can't currently be resolved at the satellite scale without further information from ground and airborne campaigns. We also now have far more spatially explicit data on different dimensions of biodiversity across taxa that are critically understanding for understanding the basic science of these incredibly diverse systems, which was not something that was explicitly incorporated in LBA. But again, with that biodiversity data, we're really at a point where scaling is very much needed between ground and satellite data. Critically also, a campaign in the tropics, which I'm kind of starting to hint at with this diagram on the right here, is going to allow us to address unanswered questions about the basic science related to how heterogeneous these different systems are, including the possible long-term or deep time kind of evolutionary histories and how that contributes to those differences. But also, as we think about the future of these systems, how can we define questions for this campaign that could potentially contribute to research that'll inform sustainable development pathways in these regions at a really critical time when science is needed to inform climate mitigation and adaptation and confront increasingly challenging trade-offs between biodiversity conservation and development. So now just to give us a better sense of what airborne campaigns have been carried out in the tropics and the potential for additional airborne campaigns given different sensors, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Pavlik, who's a scientist at NASA at JPL. And Ryan has extensive experience planning and executing NASA field campaigns around the world, including in California, Iowa, Alaska, Canada, Iceland, Europe, as well as India and Costa Rica.
Thank you, Elsa. So we would be building upon a legacy, not just of LBA and some of the other large terrestrial ecology field campaigns that have been mentioned, but a number of other NASA campaigns that have occurred in the tropics. Some of the ones that have occurred recently, was AFRISAR, which was funded by the NASA Carbon Monitoring System program, along with the European Space Agency and the Gabonese Space Agency. There's actually been multiple AfriSAR campaigns at this point. There's also Bioscape, which is occurring at this moment, funded by the NASA Biodiversity Program, along with various South African agencies. AVIRIS, the Airborne Imaging Spectrometer, has been to India twice in a joint campaign with the Indian Space Agency. And there's possibility for a third post-monsoon campaign in coming years. Also in the tropics, there have been campaigns in Hawaii. There have been other assorted campaigns. JEDI has done extensive CalVal work using Elvis and in Costa Rica. And recently, last year, AVIRIS flew in a number of countries in Latin America dedicated towards sensing methane emissions from natural gas infrastructure, as well as solid waste disposal. So what this is illustrating is that NASA does have the capability to fly our suite of instruments in the tropics across multiple continents, but it will be a challenge of this scoping study to find out where we can fly in terms of where we're welcome to fly, where we financially can sustain a long-term campaign, and overlaying that with where we're going to get the biggest science bang for the buck. And that's where we're going to need your inputs. As Peter mentioned earlier with above, he showed a map of the flight lines from above, but under those points, there are 6,000 field sites that were largely not funded by NASA efforts. And the same will be true of a potential future PANGEA campaign, that we will be relying on existing infrastructure, whether it's flux towers or other sorts of plot-based networks. And that is where we need to figure out where to fly and where to focus our efforts. So with that, I will hand it back to Elsa.
Thanks, Ryan. So as I wrap up before we get into questions, what I want to do is really kind of focus in on the overarching questions of PANGEA and the science themes. So the broad questions that we are aiming to address with a PANGEA campaign in the tropics is, what are the similarities and differences within and between tropical regions? How are the vulnerability and resilience of tropical forest ecosystems changing with global change, both climate change and land use change? And how can this information be used to guide decision-making for climate adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity conservation? Again, what we need to do over this next year is really define science questions that can be addressed with this campaign that actually further define our ability to address these overarching questions. The current science themes are biogeochemical cycles and carbon dynamics, ecosystem structure, function, and diversity, climate feedbacks and interactions, and social ecological systems. So we will start to form working groups around these science themes, as well as a working group on feasibility and a working group on community engagement. And we look forward to sharing more information with you all about that in the weeks to come. Speaking of community engagement and next steps, PANGEA is really focused on working with people across disciplines, across career stages, and across continents, with the goal of determining scientific priorities across the tropical research community, articulating the most pressing and feasible, right? We have to balance this pressing and feasibility within the science questions. Again, defining the geographic scope and identifying field sites, creating a research environment that supports historically marginalized researchers and communities, and guiding societal responses to land cover change and climate change. One thing I want to highlight here is that there's a lot of work that is starting to really highlight and emphasize the need for equity when thinking about these types of efforts in the tropics. So this is a paper that came out last year. that in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution that emphasizes the need for considering kind of going beyond just open data when thinking about making forest data, particularly tropical forest data, open and fair. And the paper argues, I would encourage you all to take a look at it, argues that open data doesn't in fact mean open for all and can actually widen or entrench structural inequalities. And that many countries actually hold substantial areas of tropical forests are some of the least capable of investing in science and development given limited resources. And this paper does a really nice job of putting forth concrete recommendations for how to overcome some of these challenges and issues. And so funding is a big one, which we've talked about. Funding direct and indirect costs, overhead, data curation, data infrastructure needs. So to come back to something that's been mentioned a few times, which is that, for example, with Above, there's been a reliance on partnering with institutions that can support some of that field work and existing infrastructure. One of the challenges with PANGEA will be identifying potential additional funders that can support data collection and data infrastructure needs and curation in some of these countries in the tropics. So that's a challenge that we are fully aware of and aim to tackle head on. Another recommendation is embracing holistic definitions of authorship, ensuring results are communicated in the originator's languages, developing international agreements to support capacity building and stable long-term careers for data providers, and developing deep, long-term, equitable collaboration. So we also recognize that one challenge of 1 year to scope and effort in the tropics, where relationships are critical for success, we really are going to start to do a lot of building of relationships, but also really will rely on partners who have solid and established relationships to engage with us in ways as they deem appropriate. So before we go to questions, I just want to remind you all that there's this Get Involved page on our website. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute here. If you go to our website and go to the Get Involved page, you can click this link and that'll take you to a form where we would love to hear from you. You can fill in your contact information and share information about how and when and in what ways you'd like to be involved in the campaign. So we very much look forward to hearing from you all. And I think with that, we're now at a point where I would love to open it up for questions and discussion. And so there's a couple ways to do this now. You can raise your hand and I will do my best to take a look at that participants list. Please raise your hand, or you can also put a question in the chat and Hannah will help me facilitate that. When you do speak or ask your question in the chat, please introduce yourself. And if you're lacking in questions right now, one of the things we would very much love to hear from you all about is, what do you hope to see from this campaign? What do you want it to accomplish? And if you have any questions for the leadership team beyond just me as well, that's definitely all right as well. And please do continue to drop ideas and suggestions into the Google Jamboard. So I'm going to try to pull up participants here and see if I can see any raised hands. Hannah, do we have any questions in the chat as we wait for folks to raise hands?
There's nothing in the chat, but there's something in the Google Jamboard. So someone asked, does Pangea include Central America, and does it include mountain environments?
Great question. So that is something that we are going to have to scope. With respect to Central America, it absolutely can and will include Central America if we identify specific ground and airborne sites there that make sense. But yeah, we're talking about the entire tropics with respect to the scoping of the campaign. One thing that will very much have to be scoped, and I've gotten questions before about, does it also include mangroves or montane systems? For feasibility reasons, we may ultimately end up needing to restrict this to lowland tropics, but we are very interested in scoping the potential to include montane systems, mangroves, kind of all of these different systems within the tropics. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm seeing question from, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce names, Catherine Potvin, and then we'll go to Katie Gold. Catherine, if you still have a question, please feel free to just unmute yourself. Okay, we'll come back to Catherine in a minute. Let's go to, oh, Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the computer froze.
No problem.
I'm delighted that you have one working group on social ecological system, and you're presenting tropical forest. One thing maybe that could be added to give it a little bit of meat on the social aspect is the fact that it's been shown, at least for the neotropics, that the bulk of tropical forests, intact tropical forests, are in the custody of indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if you're looking for scoping and if you're looking for
I think we just lost you, Catherine.
you know, both in terms of the questions, in terms of the support they're getting to maintain, and in terms of their, you know, traditional land use and what we can learn from that. So I'd be delighted to take part in this.
That's wonderful. You broke out a minute there in the middle, Catherine, but what I gathered was the importance of engaging Indigenous communities, given how much land they are is in the custody of Indigenous communities, at least in the neotropics, and I would argue across the tropics. So that's very much something we're considering, and also very much a space in which we really are looking for partners who have established relationships with Indigenous communities, or from members of Indigenous communities themselves who would like to engage in this process. So thank you for that. And Catherine, if you have more details on that, please feel free to contact me or put more information on the Jamboard so that we can follow up. Let's go to Katie Gold.
Hi, team. Wonderful introduction. My name is Katie Gold. I'm an assistant professor of plant pathology at Cornell University. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you hope to or intend to include the interactions of agroecosystems on the borders of your regions of study? Is that part of your goal for this study, to capture those dynamics as well? Or is it not something that you expect to include?
It is something we expect to include. It's a great question. So one of the things we're doing actively, and we'll kind of continue to do, is reach out to different program managers beyond just the terrestrial ecology program. We feel there's a major opportunity here for this to be a cross-cutting campaign. And in a lot of ways, speak to a lot of the goals of different components of the applied sciences at NASA, which of course includes agroecosystems and agricultural work. And so we are actively starting to engage more partners, for example, the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. And we're thinking a lot about not only our system would include not just intact forests. So let me start there. We will also include systems that include agroecosystems in the scope, the spatial scope of this, wherever it ends up taking place. And in terms of thinking about how to engage different partners, there's the science questions, but there's also the data users on the other side as well. And so we'd like to start to include as many of those data users thinking about agricultural applications from these types of data as early in the process as possible. So please follow up if you have suggestions or ideas, and we can connect further on that.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome. I see Marielle's hand is up. Before we go to Marielle Smith, do we have any questions in the chat?
We have a question in the Q&A from Kevin Jabo asking, I'm curious to know what other species, especially birds, respond to these changes. Will you be addressing species-based responses too?
Great question. So of course, a lot of satellites, actually, Ryan, do you want to take a response to this in terms of kind of our ability to include other taxa? Or if not, I'm happy to.
I mean, I think that's something that we want to scope. And I think that if folks have ideas for how to engage in that, that would probably fall under the working group, the second working group of ecosystem structure, function, and composition. So, you know, there are even satellite-based methods with animal telemetry, but there may be other ways of incorporating species-based responses to the changes that we're seeing in the tropics.
Great, thanks. And Kevin, we can follow up with you about that too. Let's go to Marielle Smith and then Joe Mohan.
Great, thanks so much, Elsa. Well, just firstly, it's such an exciting initiative, and thanks to you and all the other presenters. Really great introduction, and you know, it's really exciting to have an opportunity to kind of, you know, contribute. I'm a lecturer now at PANGEA University in the UK. Have really strong partnerships as well with institutes in Brazil and universities. I think a lot about the impacts of land use and climate change on tropical forest structure and function. So a couple of those kind of working groups would be really excited to contribute to. I guess like one of the sort of higher level sort of questions I have in terms of the ability of many of us to contribute is just, have you thought about what the funding structure might look like if you manage to kind of get the big pot of money or, you know, opportunity for that, particularly thinking about, you know, me being in the UK and then also wanting to kind of include obviously our Brazilian collaborators as well. Like, could we sort of be included financially, or would there be, you know, maybe we could kind of put in separate grants to funding institutes, you know, grant funding places in the UK to kind of, you know, team up in terms of the funding?
Such a good question. Thanks, Marielle. And very great to hear that you're interested in being involved in some of the working groups. We'll follow up with you about that. So with respect to funding, one thing I'd like to make clear, which Marielle hinted at in her question, is that NASA funding really is limited to supporting people at US institutions. And that's a major potential shortcoming when it comes to carrying out an international campaign with international collaborators, especially at a lot of institutions in the tropics, but also including folks in Europe and elsewhere. So that those kinds of additional sources of funding support is exactly the way we're going to start to think about it. And that's something where I think if others on the leadership team would be interested in speaking to this, feel free to chime in. But there's strong partnerships already between NASA and the European Space Agency and other space agencies internationally. So I think starting to engage in conversations about the potential for support from those agencies is something we will very much explore. The valuable thing about if a campaign like this were to be funded is that it's an opportunity to really focus the science community's attention on a set of questions in a specific domain geographically beyond just NASA. So there is potential to include other funding agencies beyond space agencies. And that's something we're already exploring on the US side, but would be really good to start to explore internationally as well. And I think one thing that we're also, we haven't actively started to explore yet, but has been discussed, is this potential for public-private funding as a mixed model, because there's a lot of funding with, let's say, less strings attached if it's coming from donors than from government agencies. So all of those are going to be explored, and any input and any feedback and any ideas on how to go about doing that effectively is most welcome. Let's go to,
Thanks.
Yeah, did anybody else,
one
Michael, did you
quick
want to chime in?
response? Yes.
Yeah.
This development of this campaign is not happening in a vacuum. For example, at this time, and just about a week ago, the Congo Basin Science Initiative just launched. And what they are interested in, I should say we, because I'm on their leadership team, are interested in doing is building a scientific project to understand the Congo Basin as a regional entity in the Earth system, and many more things. I encourage you to look up the Congo Basin Science Initiative. We'll include that somewhere in our webpage. And so we don't have to think about necessarily our program in a vacuum. There's a lot going on, and hopefully there'll be more going on that we can partner with.
Great, thanks. Anything else from our leadership team before we move on? Okay.
I could just point out, and Peter can maybe follow up, that Above was also a multinational effort. I mean, it was led by the United States and with large contributions from Canada, but there were also airborne contributions from the German Space Agency, as an example. And I think that part of our efforts, either in the scoping study or in a later science definition phase, would be to reach out to those sort of agencies, European Space Agency and others like that, to solicit their engagement in this potential campaign.
Thanks, Ryan.
That's a really good point, Ryan. And Above has a structure of that we could go into, not on this call, of affiliated projects where people with other funding sources, whether it's a U.S. source or an international source, affiliate on a formal basis and with above, and are able to task satellite acquisitions and request airborne flights over their sites and things like that. Even though NASA's hands are tied with this funding of, directly to foreign institutions. There is one exception with the funding for international participants, is that there is a mechanism for providing invitational travel. It was not implemented for the scoping studies, but it's something that the scoping studies can describe for future field campaigns. That invitational travel is something that, to people at international institutions, is something that NASA is capable of providing during a field campaign.
And those then there's a lot of nuance to what NASA can and can't fund. And I think one of the things I've thought about doing, and I think probably will do, is make that clear as we can possibly make it, and put that on our website, so that we're as transparent as we can be about the funding limitations, what NASA can and cannot fund, and then kind of how we're going about seeking additional funding. Let's move on now to Joe Mohan, and then we'll go to questions in the chat. And I apologize again if I'm mispronouncing names.
Hi, great, thanks. This was great presentation, good information. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Irvine, in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department. My research pretty much centers around nutrient transport and the fate of nutrients in mostly lacustrine and hydrologic systems. So I'm always thinking about what happens to the leaves after they fall off effectively. Where does that carbon go? And a lot of it goes into lakes and wetlands, which in these tropical systems, I have partners in the Pantanal that worked down in the world's largest wetland, and have done some research in the African Great Lakes. I guess my question is for the team, for while we're scoping, I don't know, like, are we trying to come up with science questions, obviously, but then also suggesting to NASA, like, hey, it's really hard to get space-based observations on really tiny wetlands, and yet they bury a ton of carbon disproportionately to their size. So are those the sorts of questions that we'll be sussing out, like suggesting instrumentation or those sorts of things when picking out sites? Thanks.
Great question. Yeah, thanks, Joe. So, and I can follow up, and we can start to make more information available on our website about what came out of LBA and above. And there's some really interesting examples from LBA on those exact kinds of questions that emerged. And yes, a big part is defining science questions, defining geographic scope, but also as we define the science questions, it's really about defining science questions that again require kind of paired ground information to unpack what we're just not capturing, or better understand what we are capturing with satellite data. And so some of that, especially with kind of the systems you're describing, also below ground components, there's a real need, of course, for ground measurements. And we will be thinking about everything from those different kinds of ground measurements to sensors, airborne sensors that NASA has at their disposal. And so part of what we'll be doing is kind of trying to educate as much of the research community on what NASA has that we can use and leverage with respect to those airborne sensors, but then also where the gaps need to be filled, and learning from you all and working collectively to identify what ground measurements are needed is going to be a big part of this. So it'd be great to have you involved in one of the working groups if you're interested. Anybody else on the leadership team want to respond to that? Okay. Hannah, do we have any more questions? Yeah, you're welcome, Joe. Thanks. Do we have any more questions in the chat?
We have a question in the Q&A asking what feasibility means in this context.
Good question. So let's use this as our last question, because I'm also keeping an eye on time and I'd like to wrap it up. Michael or Peter, do you want to take that, or would you like me to take that?
I'll be glad to make a quick remark.
Sure.
Feasibility is about a number of things. The first one is can we afford it? The second one is can we permit it? And there are places where you do research wherever they are, where you need permission, and who gives those permissions, and are they available to a NASA campaign? Are they available for flying? Are they available for work on the ground, etc.? So I think those are two key issues with regard to feasibility, cost and logistics, and permissions.
Great, thank you. And just super quickly, so a big part of that feasibility is with respect to the feasibility for airborne campaigns. One of the things we're thinking about, of course, is kind of how do we piece this puzzle together of existing kind of ground measurements that we can leverage and build on with airborne campaigns, and then ultimately doing satellite analyses and modeling pantropically. And so there could be things that are feasible with respect to ground measurements in places that are infeasible to fly. And we can explore that too, kind of the different types of feasibility for different parts of the campaign. But hopefully that helps to address your question. Just to keep us on track here, because we're at time, I just want to move back to the slides here and reiterate the timeline will be posted on our website with more details forthcoming. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out. And then I want to remind everybody of this Get Involved page. We would love to hear from you. Please fill out this form if you would like to be in touch and get involved in any way, shape, or form. And I believe that's it. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will make sure this webinar gets posted on the website, and we'll send an email out once that's up. Hannah will be working to gather all the information from the chat. Thank you, Hannah. We'll look at that. We'll also look at the Jamboard. And a reminder for those who will be able to attend AGU, we'll have a similar town hall there. And we hope to have many more events like this, including workshops, but also these types of webinars to gather feedback. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Hi, everyone. Hannah, let's keep it on for just a minute so we can get info from the chat. Let me know if you need a hand.
I think I'm okay right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, did you want us to stick around?
You all can hop off. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'll stick around with Hannah for a minute just to make sure we gather everything.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Did you get everything?
I have the chat. I'm going to stop the recording.
Yep, sounds good.